So you can see this is a side view of two boxes. So it's the bottom box from the side here, a box above like so. Now two things to notice, or several things to notice actually. You notice that those cells aren't perfectly perpendicular. They have that slight angle up. Bees also, if you think about it, they have an organization in their hive, and it's a very efficient organization. And in this picture, if you look, we can pretty much make out what the different parts of that are. If you look, there's a circle, and it's darker cells here. And if you even look at that comb, you'll notice on the one side of it, it has a dark ring. That one shows, yeah, you can see the ring to it, where it's dark here and it's a little lighter out in these corners. So there's this round circular pattern that you see here, and that's where they're producing brood. And the reason that's dark on that is because the brood, whether it's the larva that's developing or the pupating bee, they produce wastes, and the wax absorbs that waste and it darkens the wax. Beeswax, I should have brought a frame in from a honey super where I've kept the queen from laying eggs in it, and it's still white. So that darker comb is where they produce brood. And that's what this is. So it's two boxes, one above the other. You see the circle of brood, and then you see a lighter circle right there at the top of empty cells, or no, not actually empty cells, but of lighter cells, and those contain pollen. We talked about last time, I think it was Francois Hubert, the blind scientist from the 1700s who discovered that bees use pollen for developing brood. That's its primary use. The nurse bees in the hive take pollen, and their mandibles have organs that produce compounds that mix with that pollen to produce food to feed brood.
Yeah, sorry, which ones are the pollen? Is it
Okay.
above the dark, the light color?
Let's see if this thing works. This is ancient, so I don't even know if it works, but let's look. All right, so this ring here, inside this ring, all right, that's brood. This very small ring right here where you see those lighter colored cells, that's pollen. They use it primarily to feed developing brood, so it makes perfect sense that you would put it right on the edge of where you're placing your brood. I mean, from an organizational standpoint, you know, there's that architecture to the nest, the inside and the operation of the nest. The next ring out, which is out in here, it's a little darker, but you notice that's where they've stored honey. So if you can think of this as a three-dimensional thing, the brood is a ball. So if you came down in here, you could look and it would be circular this way and circular this way, and that would be their brood. And then just out on the outer edge of that would be pollen, and then out beyond that would be honey. So they've got that architecture, and it's a sensible architecture because you have the brood and you have the stuff that you use to feed the brood nearest to it, and then you have honey on the outside, which is just being preserved primarily for, well, they use it for carbohydrates all the time, but also preserving it for future use. And the magnificence of this is all of that structure, all of that organization occurs in the dark. If you think about it, inside the beehive, it's dark. Inside a cavity in a tree, it's dark. So all of this is done with pheromones, with smell. They can sense where there's new and developing brood, eggs have been laid, larvae is developing. They can sense that in the dark, and then they store the pollen on the fringe and store the honey beyond. Typically in the hive, they try to store most of the honey higher, above the brood rearing area, and that's where they instinctively put it. And in the winter, they instinctively cluster, and that cluster of bees, when the weather is cold, will instinctively move up because that's where they put their honey if somebody hasn't moved it around on them, which shouldn't happen, but could.
So we try to limit their movements and make them fill up that first box completely first?
Well, what I do, and I think most beekeepers, when you start a new colony of bees, you don't want to give them too much to do. I've heard it said, and I know they're bees, but I've heard it said that they become, if you give them too much to do, they become demoralized. Now, it's not really that they're demoralized, but that's the way they behave. You know, they're like a lot of people I know, myself included. If I have too much to do, I don't do anything. I stopped doing anything. You know, I just like, well, I don't even know what to do next, you know? And there's a million things I could do next, but for some reason, suddenly I won't do any. Well, they're a little bit like that. So as beekeepers, when we start a new hive, typically what we do is we start out with a basic hive. So like in this case, I would just have one box. I'd put the bees in it. I would allow them to produce comb, fill it out, build it out. And when it was 70 to 80% built out, I'd give them another box. And I just add boxes on one at a time rather than just dump them all on and walk away. Because if you just give them way, way, way too much space, it'll just be a mess. But we'll talk more about that. This is a photograph of a frame. And it, you know, the things we talk about them doing are never exactly right. I mean, they're creatures, so they don't measure this wall and that wall and say, okay, we're going to get right in the middle of it. But they do things generally the way we describe. So if you look at this frame, for example, the brood, this is brood. Those tan colored caps are where they have pupating brood. And you notice here then, if you could look in these cells right here, you'd see pollen. Just in that one little ring of, you know, in the spring, they use that pollen almost as quick as it comes in the door. I mean, you watch the foragers returning from the field. The ones that have pollen, that are foraging for pollen, they'll have it on their back legs, it'll be visible. The ones that come in without are bringing in nectar or bringing in honey. And you'll see in the spring of the year, the preponderance of them coming in early on with pollen is significant. And they'll be using that pollen in brood rearing almost as quickly as it comes in the door. That's why, you know, you look, there's just that little rim there. And that's like 2 or 3 cell width around the brood area, because this comes in, it goes right back out. It comes in, somebody stores it, and then somebody comes and collects it and puts it to work. So it comes in and goes out just as quick. In the fall of the year, they start to slow down. And you'll see those rings of pollen get bigger, and there'll be entire frames of pollen on the outer periphery of where they're producing their brood. And they'll store it over winter, so come spring, man, they got a lot of pollen to start with. And that's, if they do that, all the better. But you see the shape. You can see that ring architecture. And then this is capped honey. And you notice that the caps are made of wax. They're made of beeswax. These caps are made of beeswax, but you can see there's an obvious difference in their appearance. And the reality is these caps are intended to seal the cells with honey in them. And it's a solid cap. These caps have a living being beneath them, and you have to be able to move air across that, because it's a breathing organism beneath. So they produce a different texture and a different, for want of a better word, a different type of wax, or at least the way they put it on the cell is different, and it makes it look different as well.
What is the wax made of?
I'm sorry?
What is the wax made of? Like, how do they make the
It's beeswax is a real complex carbohydrate, and you know, I do beeswax. When I harvest honey, I'll take frames like I showed you, that one frame that was capped honey, and we'll do this in May. We'll do it in May. I take a hot knife and I cut those caps off, and that wax then I'll harvest, filter, and I'll make candles out of it, and I'll make, and I sell it to people who make creams and skin creams and lotions and soaps and things. It's a real complex carbohydrate, and it's, in my opinion, maybe the most underappreciated product of the hive. Now, I don't take the cells from the comb, because the bees will reuse it. And the reason why, it used to be when you went to the market and you went to buy honey, you could get honey with the comb in it. You try to find that today. It's hard to find, and there's a good reason for it. Beekeepers have realized the biological price that bees make to produce that comb. And it's tremendous. It's estimated that it takes 7 to 10 pounds of honey to produce 1 pound of beeswax. That much energy and that much of the carbohydrates go into producing it. It's a tremendous biological expense. So to cut a section of that out and put in a jar of honey, most beekeepers go, oh, no, oh. And so, in my case, like I say, the only wax I tend to harvest is the cappings wax, which I use for candles and to sell to soap makers and lotion makers.